Hi, my name is Sarah Berman, and I am your host today for the OWSCycon 2019 panel discussion on morals and ethics in fiction. That's assuming we have any. So let's jump right in and get introductions going. We'll just go clockwise from me on my little screeny. So we'll start with Erin.
Hi, excuse me. I'm Erin Casey. I'm an urban fantasy and fantasy writer. I'm promoting my book, The Purple Door District, which came out in December 2018, and the second one, Wolf Pit, is coming out in 2019, so I'm super excited. Also, I have birds, so you'll probably hear birds during this.
All right, Holly.
I'm Holly Glowgown Morgan. I write primarily sci-fi, dystopian Dying Earth. I've recently finished my trilogy, the Midnight to Morning trilogy, with Midnight to Morning, Sunrise to Shadows, and Evening to Eternity comes out in June, and the next work in progress, Song of Survival, will be out by December of 2019.
Very nice. And Timothy?
I'm Timothy Bateson, an urban fantasy and science fiction writer. I also the executive director of this year's OWSCycon 2019. So we've got a lot of exciting stuff coming up, and this panel is one of them.
Awesome. And again, I'm Sarah Berman, author of the Runespells series and a lovely collection of everything short story. So let's dig right into morals and ethics in fiction. Do you guys really brush on morals and ethics in the topics of your books?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I don't think you can write a good story without looking at them. One of the things I deal with is abuse of power.
Mm-hmm.
We have a world setting we use, Shadows over Seattle, my wife and I, and we have various factions within the city. They're all supernatural creatures, and there's a police force that likes to think they can actually police it. But they are definitely using some very questionable methods.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I mean, a friend of mine said that anytime you write a book, in some way you're going to have ethics or morals play in there. And whether it's through your characters or you kind of put in your own morals or beliefs in there, you know, it's going to be there. I know my characters definitely have certain type of ethics and morals, such as everybody does not like the vampires feasting on people in public. Because it can blow their cover. Also, it's just like, can you not make a sheep out of everybody? Because that's just really crude. So between the different factions, they have their own morals and beliefs. But I also get a little bit political in my stuff, too.
Yeah, and in my books, they go all the way from your traditional moral values all the way up to things like there is a tool which can take somebody's latent abilities and enhance them. So could make somebody who might be mildly empathic empath almost to the point of telepathy. Mm-hmm. And it's, well, how do you pick and choose? And then what happens when somebody has created a copy of it and starts running wild with it? Mm-hmm. You know, so you've got a lot of boundaries. Where are the boundaries that are happening? And it goes full spectrum from one between the other.
Very nice. I like to play with the gray areas where morals and ethics are frequently called into question. My main character ends up getting into situations where she has to do things that are in fact morally questionable for the greater good, and dealing with the implications of that, of the entire idea of that. I actually have an entire section that I dedicated to a discussion about whether or not heroes get to survive. and not just because, you know, they might actually die, but because just by having to make those hard choices, their spirits, their, you know, what makes them who they are, can be forever destroyed or changed because of the decisions that they have to make.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's particularly interesting because one of the things we were discussing yesterday was whether or not, when we're making our characters, what decisions have formed them. And I find a lot of the time the darker characters are usually among the more interesting because of the things they've had to go through to get where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, they're looking at, a lot of the time they are already having to deal with the fallout from some of those decisions. I've got one example where he's basically an antagonist at this point of the story, but he's there having come through something that he would have been classified as the hero for. It's just at the end of the day, having dealt with it, it's changed his perspective on things, and he's not exactly still all in one piece.
Yeah.
I like. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go on.
I was gonna say I like playing with the effects of magic and going with the gray line there. So I have magic users called Magi who can draw from Earth's magic, and I have witches who are sensitive to ether but aren't necessarily born with the ability to use it. And then the middle ground with them are these magic users called Senkas. And Senkas usually dabble in what they would classify as dark magic. So voodoo, necromancy, healing but causing other things to suffer in order to heal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very gray line because a lot of people will be like, well, that's just dark magic and everything. And they're like, well, if I kill a plant to heal a human, is that really a bad thing? And, you know, they may have the ability to bring people back from the dead. And the question is, well, you may have the ability, but should you do it?
Should you?
So
Right.
they are fun characters to play around with.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have to get into their head and see what makes them tick and what steer them towards that direction. So
Right.
that the magic part is always fun for me.
Well, and by having such a gray outlook on morals and ethics, you know, we have those beloved characters that we call anti-heroes. I mean, who doesn't love a great anti-hero, right?
Right.
So, do you guys like to play around with the anti-hero kind of trope?
In the new novel that I'm writing, yes, there is a very distinct anti-hero. She's kind of bouncing around between wanting to do the right thing, not really wanting to do the right thing, doing things that were incredibly questionable, especially towards the main character, and then at the end, you know, realizing that, well, maybe it's time to kind of choose which way I really want to go with my life. And, you know, she has a decision to make. But she is very unwilling at first to go along.
Mm-hmm.
I have a medieval fantasy that I actually put on the back burner for a while because I got too in deep with it, and editing wasn't going well because I was cutting out things I shouldn't have cut out, and et cetera, et cetera. But the main character herself becomes a anti-hero. She is against the establishment basically because she doesn't believe in it. She thinks it's wrong. And you have a bunch of people, her sister especially, who's like, oh no, you're turning into the villain and the bad guy. And she's like, no, I'm not. I just, what you believe in, what you're following is going to lead to destruction. And it's a lot of fun to play around with that and to try to convince the readers to see each character's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And really get into their heads. That's why I really love villains that you can kind of relate to, that when they start doing their monologuing, for example, you sit there and go, well, crap, I kind of see where they're coming from. And you're like, am I rooting for the villain now or for the hero?
I thought rule number 1 of the villain's handbook was thou shalt not monologue.
Right? Or at least not get caught monologuing.
Because let's be honest, the hero is going to not do the honourable thing at this point. They are going to attack. If you're busy monologuing, the hero is going to take you down.
Also, no capes.
They get caught in everything, right?
Right?
But it is interesting looking at those grey areas and discovering where people have come from to get where they are. It's very, a lot of it's emotional based, in my opinion, in my experience, is looking at the emotions that have formed the character to the point where they're at. And coming from the perspective of, yeah, okay, I've made some questionable choices, or I have to make some questionable choices. Can I do it, or will I do it? And I find with Richard, who's actually my protagonist, he has a big problem doing things the legal way, because he's very direct in how he deals with things. And, you know, he has a situation where it's a case of, okay, I hear a scream from the other side of the door. I could investigate, but the door's locked. What am I going to do? Are we going to face a charge of breaking and entering, or are we going to call the police?
Right.
Given that he's probably on several wanted lists, probably not a good idea to do the latter. So he's probably going to break the law yet again. But it's one of those things. He thinks he's doing it for the right reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's kind of like Darth Vader.
Yes, as my wife said, Darth Vader is an interesting example.
He was trying to save the life of the woman that he loved and ends up destroying.
Now, that's an interesting point, because there has been a lot recently about a lot of movies, especially, that have turned the older stories on their heads. You've got Wicked, which tells the story of the Wicked Witch of the West.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Maleficent, which tells the story of the evil queen from Sleeping Beauty. And both of those kind of show how this good versus bad thing is not only kind of a matter of perspective, but also a matter of who gets to write the story at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I do find a lot going back and looking at those stories, though, as they're told from the villain point of view.
Mm-hmm.
You're off a lot of the time the story doesn't line up with the hero version to any degree. Especially when we're talking about the movies.
Yeah.
It's very rare that you actually see any incidents coinciding between the two storylines. But you do get a look at the background of the villains, which I find more interesting. I think really, if you're going to tell the hero-villain perspectives on the same story, you really need to look at what actually has to happen between the two characters,
Mm-hmm.
and have those events coincide. You can't just tell two completely different stories that are, well, okay, the villain is like this because, and the hero is trying to stop the villain, because you always get the hero's story first and never the villain's.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's just a fact of the way that these stories are approached. It's okay, so we have the villain. Why are they like that? But how do they see the story unfolding? It's which of the two is lying to us at this point.
Oh, that's a good point.
They do say history is written by the winners, but if you go back to look at the story of Maleficent, who's the winner?
Well, yeah. And you also have the idea that, you have every story has three versions, his, hers, and the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always that perspective where, it's like, maybe neither one of them is actually correct.
There's a little bit of truth from each side, but
Yeah.
I kind of liked, so I saw the Broadway show of Wicked.
Mhm.
And I actually really liked how they kind of unfolded that story, because you could see where the people would consider her wicked. They gave Elphaba's story and how she changed and how she was treated, and then they also aligned it with when Dorothy came and how that caused a change in Elphaba's life. And you got kind of both sides of it a little bit. Like, Dorothy was, trying to get home, but you have the Wicked Witch who, is being hunted down by everybody because she's cast all these horrible spells. But I like the telling of both sides with that. I thought was really interesting. Of course, then again, it also kind of made me hate Dorothy a little bit because I started siding with Elphaba.
The Wizard of Oz was always the bad guy.
I think the interesting thing to take away on that one is looking at both sides of the stories. I think Once Upon a Time as a TV series did that really well.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Oh yes,
really
incredibly well.
Characters. And you look at characters like Gold, and you look at him and you think, okay, he's supposed to be the villain, and he is to a point.
Yeah.
But he's really like the henchman to the villain, or he becomes the villain and she becomes the witch becomes the henchman, and then you've got later on you get all the questionable choices made by the heroes.
Yeah.
And a lot of what you're looking at in the storylines is basically the fallout from those choices.
Mm-hmm.
I think they tackled that with a lot of sensitivity to the reality of the stories.
I completely agree with you. I mean, you got to see through the eyes of each character what happened, how it happened, why it happened, and and some of it, like for example, for the story between Regina or the Evil Queen and Snow, like it was a misunderstanding. Snow said something wrong, which she was wrong in saying it, and it caused a death. And Regina hated her for that. Hated her after that, and then you find out there's this darker, more wicked power above them. But you get both sides of it. You get to view both characters, and I think that's awesome. That's why I like telling stories in multiple POVs. Like, I want to get the villain's perspective, the so-called villain's perspective. I want to get the protagonist's perspective, and kind of have the readers decide, like, who am I going to follow in the end.
Mm-hmm.
What really is the story? What you can get the actual truth that way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I always think it's interesting to create just enough additional perspective that yet another person can come in and take that a step further.
Mm-hmm.
If you can create enough question in what is considered a traditional story, that somebody else comes in and brings in a twist that really changes things, that is awesome.
Mm-hmm. I think it also sorry, go ahead.
Oh no,
I was just going to say, I think it also shows that your characters are more well-rounded that way.
mm-hmm.
They're not two-dimensional. You get this character at the surface value, but you also get what's underneath. And you get that for everybody, and the different opinions of each other and how they're viewed. So it makes for a much more engaging story, I feel.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a personal theory that spec fic, the overall umbrella for sci-fi, fantasy, and all of the subgenres therein, and horror and paranormal, have all kind of replaced the classical genre of satire as a way of pointing out social and political points that would not necessarily be accepted or acceptable if just, spoken bluntly.
My husband and I just were talking about this not even an hour ago. And because I was like, this is the panel we're going to be discussing, and he's like, isn't that the point of sci-fi and fantasy, to kind of make people think and push those boundaries and do and say the stuff you really can't get away with anywhere else? And I'm like, Yeah.
Yeah, and I think by dealing with it as fiction, it makes it a point bringing people into the story and effectively forcing them to think through these points.
Mhm.
I also think it's one of those things that's been happening for a long time. It's not a recent change.
Yeah.
You go look back at some of the old, what are now considered classic sci-fi stories, or even some of the early dystopian materials. It really makes you think about where things are going. I mean, even before stories like 1984 or Fahrenheit 451, I think it was happening way back in the storylines that were being run in the papers.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, probably the most famous satire is essentially fantasy, and that's Gulliver's Travels.
Right.
And then, one of the earliest stories that we have, recorded in relatively total original old middle new English, whichever it is the Canterbury Tales. All of those stories have an element of fantasy or the paranormal or the mysticism, and they are in fact made to have a moral point to them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yes, they do.
So what we're looking at, really, are we looking at spec fiction as being the modern fable? Are we as writers trying to make a point and teach lessons in the process?
Well, I think that another interesting question is it more effective if people come across those lessons more naturally or organically, or is it something that we as writers should make an effort towards and possibly, kind of force it?
I don't think we should be forcing it, no. Because once you start looking at that doing it that way, you're basically loading your point of view onto the reader, which is something you don't want to be doing as a writer, I don't think. Not if you want to keep them as a reader.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. The entire concept of what people can can do with these storylines. Probably my favorite example is the concept of racism and discrimination as an overall theme of the X-Men comic books. It's like it seems so obvious in retrospect, but people soaked up those stories without thinking of it necessarily in that way. And then all of a sudden, faced with a similar situation, only instead of mutants, it's Muslims, or instead of mutants, it's immigrants, or instead of mutants, it's, XYZ, turkeys flying in from Zombieland, I don't know, whatever. All of a sudden we're seeing these parallels, and you have an entire generation of people who are going, aha, I've seen this before. So,
it's pushing and trying to get those little bits of like those values, those lines, those little quandaries in there without pushing so hard.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
They push back.
Yeah. You want to be able to kind of insert it in there, but I think more subtly, just because I've had a lot of people say, well, if you try to just put your opinion into the story and shove it down the reader's throats, they're going to feel like you're preaching at them. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, you don't necessarily have to do that, but you can, the situations that your characters get thrown in can be that moral compass of what you believe and, what's ethically right, what's ethically wrong. Like, for example, and I'm a little bit on the feminist train right now with everything going on in society at the moment, but like the very first chapter of Wolf Pit, I have a female character almost get attacked, and my other one just is getting scolded for protecting her, and she's like, why am I the one getting in trouble when it was this dude who tried to hurt my friend? Like, why is that always happening? And my little pull on politics right now with.
Yeah, I've seen a similar situation growing up. I was bullied at school, and I was the one who got to see the therapist. So yeah, I made it interesting for them on the simple basis of, okay, these guys are the ones doing the bullying. I'm the one seeing the therapist. I apparently have anger management issues, something I did throw into playing with Richard. And the first thing they did was they handed me a rag and said, throw it around the room till you feel better. Okay, it went out the window.
Anger management issues, love.
You know, I always found that interesting that like the big defense that people have is, well, you know, I'm hurting you, but you're the one getting angry. And it's like, well, of course I am. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
and I think that's something that as authors we can really bring into our characters, is that anger and frustration that we feel, because it's like, dude, of course I'm angry. Look at what you're doing.
Right.
And being able to show that perspective without you know, necessarily being the one who's sitting there going, but I, you
Yeah.
know.
It's a case of bringing the points across, making people think about them without actually getting up on your soapbox and slamming it down their throat.
Right.
Yes, exactly. Stay off the soapbox.
So
It's creative ways to just slip it on in there.
I'm gonna TLDR this with in order to effectively bring in your morals and ethics into your writing, you should show, not tell.
Yep. Yep.
Agreed. Very definitely.
I feel called out.
Well, don't get angry at it, or else Timothy will give you a rag to throw around.
I'll get off my soapbox.
I always wanted a soapbox. Nobody ever gave me one, though. I just had to
Well, mine's
click on
done-
random objects.
I don't have a soapbox. I use those little tablets now.
Yep.
Ah.
Okay, so what kinds of okay, how to phrase this? I find myself occasionally feeling a great deal of pressure to take seriously the responsibility of having published works that have, you know, certain moral and ethical perspectives being written into them.
Mhm.
Do you ever find yourself thinking about that, or struggling with it, or considering it in any way?
I've rewritten entire sections of outlines on this new work in progress because of just that. Because I don't even know how to describe it. You know, you want badly to put it in there, but how much is too much, and how far is too far, and is it just going to end up turning the reader off, type of thing. I don't know.
Yeah, one of the things I play with in my stories is, does the end justify the means?
Right, exactly.
It's very difficult to find a point where you can draw the line and say, okay, I can't cross this point. You know, certainly with one of my characters, she's very much I know what has to be done, and I'm going to do what it takes to do it. But then you get people like Richard who actually have a moral compass, even if they don't always realize it. So he's not going to cross certain lines that the other person certainly would, and has.
And when you're trying to write to a certain audience, like what's happening in my brain and in the outlines of what's going on in this not in as much in the Midnight to Morning story as in this new work. I know who my audience is and what they would probably tolerate and not tolerate. And it's, again, yeah, right, like you said, it's finding that line that pushes it just enough without turning that entire group off.
Yeah. Although sometimes it is kind of fun to skate that line.
It is.
I have a scene in one of my books where my main character, who is not a Christian, gets into a fight with an extremely fundamentalist, very fanatical Christian, and ends up having this huge knockdown, drag-out fight interspersed with essentially biblical debate. And that was a lot of fun to write, because she's essentially like, just shut up and stop shoving your stuff down my throat. Bam, bam, bam. Yeah.
This person was obviously a reader.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because, like, you know, there's a certain amount of freedom that you can use, because your characters are not you, and you know, sometimes your characters need to be a little more extreme than you would necessarily go for.
Yes. When I'm writing, I'm like, okay, if my extended family were to read this, they're gonna be like, where did you get this level of violence from? Where did you even come up with the fact that this like, especially this situation between Ash and Sarai, the anti-hero and the main character, you know, some of the stuff she does is horrible. And you know, and I'm like, they're just gonna be like, oh my word, you know. But it's in my head, it's good writing, it helps push the point. Sorry guys, you may not think of me the same afterwards.
Right.
I just always blame road rage. It's like, yeah, that's how I know how anger feels, is I get road rage.
Pretty much. I would say, like, I have to agree with you that it's nice to kind of have the mask of the characters to hide behind a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not afraid to stand up for what I believe in, but, you know, if I have an asshole character and my good character, and they're going back and forth at each other, you know, I might have people being like, well, if you have a character like that, then you must believe this. And it's like, no. I never said that. If you would notice how these two characters are interacting, clearly you can see this is where the opinion lies. So I like having that. I don't know how many times people have had to say, like, you know, these are characters. This isn't not me spouting an opinion, even though when it comes down to it, honestly, we are putting our own opinions in our books. Mm-hmm. But we can always blame it on our characters.
A lot of the times, but I mean, it's also true conversely that whenever we have these arguments, we're also having to write out the anti-argument to it.
Mm-hmm. This is true.
We have to be able to argue both sides.
Right.
All right. Well, I know Timothy needed to cut this a little bit short, so let's do some closing up in terms of the topic. So, favorite ethical and or moral example in stories, either in your own books or others?
Ooh.
That one I should have been prepared for ahead of time.
Because I'm evil.
The list is long. It's kind of like when they ask your top 10 favorite books. It's like, I can't come down.
All of them? Wait, which genre are you talking about?
Genre, decade, subgenre.
Author.
Like when we had to do the top 5, the sci-fi, and I'm like, I figured out a way to make it more like top 40, but
I'm going to kick this one off. Ethical dilemmas. I'm going to go to Les Miserables. The character of Jean Valjean is basically imprisoned for stealing something to feed his family, but then when he's released, he's basically goes back supposedly into a crime situation, but ends up being chased down by a police officer who ends up seeing him in a completely different light towards the end. And I like to see that character development as they save each other, but one then cannot live the life he's been living without changing, and he can't face doing that.
Yeah.
Not to give away the storyline.
It's a very old story. I'm sure there's been spoilers.
But, I mean, Javert is one of those characters, he basically is faced with his own moral choices. And the dilemma basically being his duty to the law or what is right.
Yeah.
Oh, I've stumped everyone now with that one.
I can't get it. I can't get the words out. It's like there's 3 or 4 of them in my head right now, and it's like.
All right. Well, I would have to say that mine is probably, even though it's not really a great movie, the guy from 2012 that closes up the boat. You know who I'm talking about? The movie 2012, whatever. Essentially, anybody who falls under that particular trope of having to make this huge decision where some people live and some people die is really big on my list, because I mean those are pretty much impossible choices. Like, how do you even do that, right? But somebody has to. So I'm always fascinated as to what their motivations are, what their decision-making process is, and even more importantly, how they deal with it in the end when they actually do have to make those choices.
I think I would have to go with, I'm going more film, movie type, but I'd have to go with, oh my gosh, Firefly / Serenity.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, the main characters are, technically thieves, and their moral compasses may not exactly be the best, but you especially see it in Serenity, where they have to make this ultimate decision of, do we tell the truth? Do we hide it? Like, what do we do? And I think it's really jarring and really interesting, to see their dynamics and to see how their beliefs change through the story. I would say for my own writing, this isn't from Purple Door District, but rather from a YA LGBT fantasy book that I do, or that I wrote, with dragons, all the dragons. But there's a debate between a bard and my blacksmith character about what's stronger, or what's mightier, the sword or the pen, essentially. And she goes into the debate that the sword is mightier. You can't win war with words. And he argues, well, if you can't motivate the people to fight, you don't have anybody who's going to pick up that sword and fight either. So I love doing like that moral compass back and forth of like, make peace or war, or what's better.
I'm gonna have to go with like along that way. Firefly was one of the ones that was in my mind. The other one is if you go into the expanded universe, especially the original expanded universes for Star Trek, and you get into Section 31, and they have that freedom to go through those moral quandaries and make those decisions. If you wipe out this colony of 1,000 people because the people who are up and coming are going to end up becoming a warfaring species. Does the ends justify the means? You know, kind of thing. And you know, I'm definitely not the way it's being portrayed now in the modern films and all of that. They've destroyed it. But in the original Roddenberry Bible type stuff of what Section 31 was, you know, that original Watcher group, and you know, all the different things they would have had to do. But like I said, she had the best one with Firefly, because that was one of the first ones that came into my mind, because we literally just finished rewatching it. Like,
Oh my gosh,
2 weeks
I love
ago.
it. I love it.
Because I was like, I want to watch Firefly and Serenity all over again. They're like, okay.
You know that leads into the black hole of the Whedonverse.
Oh gosh, right?
It starts with Firefly. It goes on to Serenity. Next you're watching Buffy and Angel, and then you've got to watch all the Avengers films.
Oh yes, it just moves right on through.
And if you can slide Dollhouse in there somewhere, you're doing good.
Oh gosh, that's one I haven't seen yet.
That was another one that had some interesting moral work in it. Basically, the premise was the Dollhouse were volunteers who were facing problems of their own and needed money, and they basically became programmed companions or assassins or whatever was needed at the payout of either big corporations or people with large amounts of wealth. And at the end of each session, each event story, they basically got reset to be a blank slate.
Oh wow.
And then once their time or their payout was completed, they could be reinstated as their original self.
Oof.
That's really interesting and disturbing.
Thanks. I needed something else for my watch list.
I was going to say that just got added to it.
I
It's on
would
Netflix,
seriously recommend it, because there's a lot of back and forth on the should we, shouldn't we on this, as well as the implications of being able to literally live your life as a blank slate and do whatever you have to do the job. Yeah, you're programmed, as my wife said, with entire personalities and skill sets. And how that all plays out was very, very interesting.
Ooh, now see, that would be an interesting moral dilemma. Is okay, they may have touched on it because, you know, Joss Whedon is in fact brilliant, but if one of those programmed personalities decided that it preferred to stay, and which one had the right to exist more?
I'm not going to give anything away on whether that question comes up.
That means yes. That means yes.
No spoilers. No spoilers.
All right. Well, is there anything else that you guys want to talk about real quick before we do our outros?
All I'm going to say is, if you want to talk about moral ambiguity, watch Game of Thrones.
Oh yeah.
Every single last one of them is like, really? Did you not have parents?
And the scary thing is, if you look at Game of Thrones, how much of it is based on British history.
Oh, I know.
Yeah. Also, again, did you even have parents?
Out to me right before we came on and did this.
I've read enough about British monarchies to know that most of them, they either did not get raised by the appropriate people, or they were like given power way too early. And do not give a teenager power. Do not give a preteen power. That's not good.
Right.
Time, as my wife just pointed out, we have actually not watched a single episode of Game of Thrones, and I have never completed a single one of the books.
You're probably, it's probably a good thing.
We're in a household where my husband has watched all of it and read most of it, and I haven't seen any of it, and he's trying to bring it up to me, like all the different things, and I'm like, Oh, really?
And I'm sitting here still rage quitting over the episode last night. I won't say anything, but rage quit.
I think I'm stuck back on season 6. So, yeah, I'm in the middle there. But
Oh, back when it was still good.
As Sandy said, it's not our cup of Starbucks.
Wait, are you telling me my life is going to be filled with disappointment and despair?
Sorry.
Say nothing.
All right, so this has been a wonderful discussion. Let's do a quick little outro, once again telling who we are and where people can find us. So if you want to start us off, Erin?
Sure. Again, I'm Erin Casey, urban fantasy writer of the Purple Door District, and you can find me on my website at erincasey.org, and that also has all of my other social media linked to it.
All right, and Holly?
Holly Glogal Morgan, the Midnight to Morning trilogy, and soon to release Song of Sarai. Website is morgansmusing.blogspot, and I'm on Amazon and soon to be on a whole bunch of other places. Morgan's Musings will send you over to Facebook and Twitter and everything else.
All right, and Timothy?
I'm Timothy Bateson, urban fantasy and sci-fi writer. My easiest way of being found, like everyone else, is at my home site at timothybatesonauthor.com. You can find everything there. You can also find out a little bit more about OWSCycon at OWSCycon.ourrightside.com. And it's going to be a huge event, and I really am grateful for Sarah for putting these panels together. It's been an absolute blast being part of them, and you're going to be finding me all over the place this coming weekend as part of the as part of that Cycon event.
All right, and again, my name is Sarah Berman. You can find me on authorgoddess.com, and don't forget to check out our panelists on, I believe, Holly, are you on the Urban Fantasy group as well? For your?
I am.
Okay, so all of us have author booths in the Urban Fantasy page, but of course there are tons of other genre pages, so feel free to browse through those. And thank you all for joining us for this wonderful little discussion about Game of Thrones and all kinds of other oddities. And we will see you all later.